This is my true story. My son thought age made me weak and silence made me blind. One morning, he asked me to walk with him by the river behind our old farm. He said he wanted to talk, just father and son like we used to. I believed him, I always did. But that day, trust nearly drowned me. When his hands hit my back, the world went dark and cold. I should have died there, but fate had other plans. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe so more people hear my story. He said he wanted to clear the air, that we'd been distant for too long. The morning was quiet, the kind that tricks you into believing peace still lives somewhere inside broken families. The sun had barely climbed over the trees, and the fog was still crawling low across the fields. Birds moved in the distance, and the air smelled like wet soil and rust. I remember thinking how rare it was for him to ask me to go anywhere with him. For years, our words had been sharp and short, but that morning, his tone was soft. It fooled me. I thought maybe, finally, my son wanted to make peace. The path by the river was one we used to walk when he was little. Back then, he'd run ahead of me, skipping rocks, shouting at frogs, laughing every time I told him to slow down. That river had carried our memories. Fishing trips, long talks, quiet evenings. I never imagined it would someday carry something darker. We walked side by side at first. He spoke about money, about the house, about debts that had piled up. I told him I'd help, as I always had, but his answers were clipped, distracted. His eyes didn't meet mine. There was something restless in his steps, something rehearsed in the way he nodded without really listening. The river looked calm that morning, like a mirror stretched under the sky. You'd never guess how deep it ran. I remember glancing at the surface and catching our reflections. His tall frame beside my bent one. For a second, I almost smiled. I thought maybe the years of silence were ending. Maybe this was his way of starting over. But his silence wasn't peace. It was calculation. Every step we took closer to the bend, the quieter he became. By the time we reached the old tree that leaned toward the water, I could feel something wrong in my bones. The kind of feeling that doesn't shout. It whispers, slow and cold. He stopped walking and looked across the river. "You ever think about the past?" he asked. I told him I did, every day. About him, about his mother, about how fast the years had gone. He nodded again, jaw tight. Then he said something strange, something about how time buries people in more ways than one. I didn't understand what he meant. I asked him what he was talking about, but he didn't answer. Instead, he walked closer to the edge, his hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the water. I followed, careful on the damp grass. The sound of the current grew louder. The river looked harmless, but I knew it could swallow anything if it wanted to. I turned to him, about to say we should head back. That's when I noticed how still he was, too still. His shoulders were tense, his breathing shallow. He wasn't looking at the water anymore. He was looking at me. And there, for the first time, I saw something I'd never seen in my son's eyes before. Distance. The kind of distance that has nothing to do with miles. He smiled, not warm, not familiar. A tight, thin smile that said everything he didn't. The kind that hides guilt behind calm. My stomach turned cold. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words never came. The world went quiet, except for the river's murmur. If I'd known what was about to happen, I'd have turned around right then. But I didn't. I kept walking forward, one step at a time, still believing that somewhere beneath his silence was the boy I raised. The boy who once held my hand and promised never to leave me. But that boy was gone. What stood beside me that morning wasn't my son anymore. It was a man wearing his face. A man with a secret and a plan that would nearly cost us both everything. It happened so fast that I still don't know if there was warning or just instinct pretending there was. One moment we were standing side by side, the next his hand was on my shoulder, firm but not yet cruel. I turned, confused, and saw nothing but calm in his eyes, that flat calm people wear when they've already made up their mind. He said nothing, no argument, no anger, just silence. And then came the shove. a hard, sharp motion that took the ground out from under me and replaced it with air. The fall felt endless. The world turned upside down. Sky, trees, river, all spinning into one blur of motion. When my back hit the water, the cold punched through my chest like a blade. It wasn't a splash, it was an impact. The breath tore out of my lungs, replaced by a rush of icy mud and river water that burned my throat. I kicked, but the current was stronger than I remembered. It twisted me, dragged me under, pulled me into its slow, heavy grip. I saw flashes, sunlight flickering above, shadows moving on the surface, his shape standing still on the riverbank. He didn't run, he didn't shout, he just watched. I could see his outline through the rippling water, still, unmoving, waiting. That was when I understood. This wasn't a mistake, it wasn't rage, it was intention. My own son had planned this. The current carried me further out, spinning me in circles like a leaf. I tried to surface, but my coat filled with water, dragging me down. My arms were weak, my lungs screamed. I opened my mouth to call his name, but only bubbles escaped. The river didn't care who I was. It didn't care that I was a father, a man who had worked his whole life for the family now trying to erase him. It wanted to take me, and I almost let it. Somewhere between the panic and the cold, a memory flashed. His mother's voice, soft and certain, saying, "You always fight for him no matter what." So I did. I kicked, hard, and my hand brushed against a root jutting from the bank. I grabbed it, the bark tearing into my fingers. My lungs were on fire, but the pain kept me alive. I clawed upward, inch by inch, until my head broke the surface. Air, harsh, heavy, glorious, filled my chest again. I coughed, choking on water and mud, dragging myself toward the shore. The bank was slick, but I dug my fingers in like an animal, crawling through reeds and stones until I collapsed on the grass. For a long time, I just lay there, shaking, gasping, half alive. When I finally looked up, he was gone. The riverbank was empty, except for the faint marks of his shoes in the dirt. I sat there for what felt like hours, drenched, trembling, unable to think of anything but the truth. My son had tried to kill me. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the man I had defended, the person I had sacrificed everything for. He had looked me in the eye and pushed me into the water like I was nothing. As the sky began to darken, I pulled myself to my feet. Every step hurt, every breath burned. My clothes clung to me, heavy with river mud. The sound of the current behind me was slower now, quieter, as if the river itself was trying to swallow what it had seen. But I was alive. Barely, but alive. And sometimes that's enough. When I finally turned to walk toward the distant road, I looked back once. The river shimmered under the dying light, calm again, too calm. I realized then that it wasn't just my son who had secrets buried in that water. There was more beneath the surface, something waiting, something he didn't want anyone to find. And soon, he'd wish the river had taken me. The river wanted to keep me. Even after I crawled halfway up the bank, it kept pulling at me like cold hands around my ankles, trying to drag me back under. My body shook uncontrollably, from the chill, from shock, from disbelief. My clothes clung to my skin like armor made of ice, and every breath scraped my throat raw. I lay there for a moment, coughing out mud, water, and fear, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The morning sun was still there, bright and golden, mocking me with its warmth. How could the world still look the same after something like that? I could hear the river behind me, slow and steady, whispering against the rocks. It sounded innocent again, calm, almost peaceful, the same way my son had sounded when he invited me here. For a long time, I couldn't move. My legs felt like dead weight, my arms burned, and the cold had burrowed so deep into my bones that I could barely feel my fingers. But the will to live has a strange kind of strength. It doesn't roar, it hums, quiet, stubborn, constant. I turned onto my stomach and began to crawl. Each movement felt like pushing through glass. My hands slipped in the wet mud, nails breaking, palms bleeding, but I kept going. One crawl, one breath, one thought. Not yet. I don't know how long it took, But eventually I reached solid ground, rough grass, hard earth, a place that didn't move beneath me. I tried to stand, but the world tilted sideways. The edges of my vision blurred, darkening like a curtain drawing closed. I grabbed a nearby branch, steadied myself, and forced my feet to obey. The road was miles away, but I knew the direction. I had walked that path hundreds of times in my life, always beside my son. Now I was walking it alone, soaked, shivering, and half blind from exhaustion. My boots squelched with every step. The wind hit my wet clothes like knives. My lungs felt bruised. But with every painful breath, anger began to rise. Slow, hot, alive. The shock was fading, replaced by something sharper. Clarity. He hadn't slipped. He hadn't panicked. He had pushed. I kept seeing it over and over. The way his body moved, the expression on his face, the calm after. He didn't rush to help. He didn't call my name. He watched. The memory replayed with every step I took, like the river current still pulling at my mind. What kind of hatred could grow in a son's heart to make him do that? I had fed him, clothed him, paid his debts, defended him when the world turned its back. I had been his shelter, and he repaid me with silence and water. Halfway to the town, I stumbled and fell to my knees. My body wanted to give up, but something in me refused. I thought of his mother, her grave under the oak tree behind the old church. She wouldn't forgive me if I stopped now. She'd want me to fight. And so I crawled until my legs obeyed again, until the road appeared ahead like a lifeline through the trees. When I finally reached the outskirts of town, the world looked strange. People passed by, but no one recognized the old man covered in river mud and trembling like a ghost. I walked into the first building I saw, a small diner with a payphone near the door. My hands were shaking too badly to dial, so I asked the woman behind the counter for help. Her eyes widened when she saw me. I told her I needed the police. As I sat there, dripping water onto the floor, I realized something that made my stomach twist. He hadn't just tried to get rid of me. He'd done it at the river for a reason. There was something there, something he didn't want anyone to find. And when the police arrived, I decided to tell them everything, every word, every look, every lie, because the river had tried to drown me, but now it was his turn to drown in the truth. When the police arrived, I was still shivering, my hands wrapped in a diner towel and my voice rough from swallowing half the river. They looked at me the way people look at something unbelievable, half pity, half doubt. The younger officer asked my name, then the older one leaned forward and said quietly, "Sir, can you tell us what happened?" I told them everything. Every step by the water. Every word before the silence. Every detail of the shove that sent me into the current. I spoke slow, calm, steady. Not as a man lost in confusion, but as a man who had finally seen truth with his own eyes. At first, I could tell they didn't know whether to believe me. Maybe they thought I'd slipped, or maybe they thought grief had made me imagine things. But when I showed them the bruises on my arms, the cuts on my palms, and the torn threads of my coat sleeve where his hand had gripped me, their faces changed. The older officer picked up his radio, exchanged a few quick words, then nodded. "We'll head out there now," he said. "You'll come with us." The drive back to the river felt endless. The tires crunched over gravel, and the air inside the cruiser smelled of rain and leather. My clothes had started to dry, stiff and sticky with mud, and my body ached like every bone had turned to stone. But beneath all that pain, I felt something burning. Not rage, not fear, but purpose. Whatever reason my son had for what he did, I wanted the truth. And if he thought the river would hide it, he was about to learn the river forgets nothing. When we reached the bank, the place was quiet again. Too quiet. The same clear sky, the same gentle current. It looked almost innocent, but there were footprints still pressed into the mud. His and mine. The officers followed the marks with flashlights, tracing where the grass had been disturbed, where the soil still held the shape of a struggle. The younger one crouched, pointing at something glinting near the water line. The broken button from my jacket. Proof. Real, solid proof. They called for a search team. Within an hour, the place swarmed with uniforms, radios, ropes, and divers slipping into the current. The whole time, I stood at the edge, my body wrapped in a blanket, my eyes locked on the water. My son arrived not long after, pretending to be shocked. He rushed through the crowd, shouting my name like a desperate man, like he hadn't been the one to push me. I watched him from a distance, unseen behind a group of officers. His performance was perfect. The worried son, the grieving man calling for his missing father. The neighbors who gathered whispered about how devoted he was, how tragic it must be for him. If only they'd seen what I'd seen. When the divers went under, everyone went quiet. You could hear the sound of the water against the reeds and the occasional crackle of a police radio. They expected to find me, a body tangled in weeds, an accident to close their paperwork neatly. But the river had other plans. Time stretched painfully as I stood there, watching the ripples spread, waiting for something, anything, to surface. Then, one of the divers raised his arm and signaled to the others. They had found something. It wasn't me. They brought it to shore slowly, the ropes straining against the weight. Mud churned, the crowd leaned forward, and when the object finally broke the surface, a murmur ran through the officers. It was a rusted metal barrel, chained shut, heavy, old. The kind used decades ago to store chemicals or fuel. I saw my son's expression change. For a second, just 1 second, the mask slipped. His face went pale, his lips parted. He took a step back. No one noticed but me. As they dragged the barrel onto the bank, I knew it. I didn't know how, but I knew, whatever was inside, it belonged to his past. And the river he had chosen to be my grave was about to become his. He played his role so well that for a few moments, even the officers seemed to believe him. He stood near the search line, wringing his hands, pacing like a man drowning in worry. Every time someone said they'd found something, he'd rush forward, voice breaking, calling my name loud enough for the whole riverbank to hear. It was a performance crafted for sympathy, and he delivered it perfectly. Tears ready, tone trembling, words rehearsed. The crowd pitied him. I could see it in their faces. They whispered about how devoted he was, how painful this must be for a son who had just lost his father. But I watched from a distance, hidden behind the cluster of officers by the vehicles, my blanket pulled up to my chin, my face half turned away. I wanted to see what guilt looked like when it wore grief as a mask. And now I saw it. The stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes flicked toward the divers, not with hope, but with fear. He wasn't searching for me. He was waiting to see if the river had kept its secrets. When he spotted me standing far behind the patrol cars, his body froze. His eyes widened, his mouth fell open slightly. Shock, confusion, maybe even terror. For a second, he didn't move. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug in his soul. Then, quickly, he looked away, pretending he hadn't seen me. I could almost hear his thoughts spinning. How? How is he alive? He recovered fast. I'll give him that. He turned back to the officers, asked more questions, feigned concern, even shouted at them to find my father. But I had already seen through the act. Every word was a lie, every gesture a layer of disguise. The river wasn't his stage anymore. It was his courtroom, and the audience was growing. An officer approached me quietly. "Sir," he whispered, "do you want to confront him now?" I shook my head. Not yet. I wanted the truth to surface first, the real truth, not my story versus his, but something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away with tears and excuses. As the day dragged on, the divers went back under, searching deeper near the bend where he had pushed me. I saw him check his watch, step away from the group, light a cigarette with shaking hands. The air around him shifted. He was sweating even though the breeze had turned cold. One of the officers noticed too. They started keeping their eyes on him, quiet but watchful. The tension thickened when one of the divers surfaced again and waved for help. "We've got something heavy!" he shouted. The rope tightened. The crowd grew silent. My son flicked his cigarette away and took a step back, his jaw locking tight. He didn't move closer this time. He just watched. His breathing quickened. The calm expression he'd worn all morning began to crack. I could feel the moment the realization hit him. Whatever he had buried in that river, whatever secret he thought was safe beneath the current, It was coming up now. His eyes darted toward the woods behind him, as if he was already imagining a way to run. But it was too late. The officers surrounded the area as the divers pulled the rusted barrel closer to the shore. The metal scraped against rocks, groaning like something alive. It was chained, sealed, old, the kind of container that doesn't belong in a place like this. Whispers spread through the bystanders, but I stayed silent. I didn't need to say anything. The river was about to speak for me. He forced a weak laugh, trying to sound casual. "Probably just trash," he said. No one answered, not even the officers. The younger one near him just stared, eyes narrowing slightly. The air was heavy enough to choke on. I turned away for a moment and looked at the water, the same water that had tried to kill me. It moved slowly, endlessly, carrying its secrets to the surface one piece at a time. And standing there, trembling in front of everyone, my son was about to meet his. When the divers finally hauled that barrel to shore, the sound it made against the rocks didn't belong in nature. It screeched, heavy and sharp, like something that had been locked away for too long. Mud poured off it in thick ribbons, dark as oil, and the stench that followed made the officers cover their faces. The metal was old, bloated from years underwater, chains still looped around it like a secret meant to stay buried. My son stood a few steps back, arms crossed, jaw tight, pretending to be curious. But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked from the barrel to the officers, to the crowd, then back again, as if calculating how much time he had left before truth arrived. The lead diver climbed out of the river and nodded toward the older officer in charge. "We've got human remains," he said. His voice was calm, but the words sliced through the crowd like a knife. A murmur spread. Sharp gasps, quiet prayers, someone whispering, "Oh God." I saw my son's face freeze. He didn't blink, didn't move. For a second, he looked carved from stone. Then, slowly, he tried to speak. "That can't be right," he muttered, forcing a weak laugh. "There's no way." But his voice cracked halfway through. The officers didn't listen. They moved quickly, professional and focused. Cameras came out. Yellow tape stretched across the bank. The lid of the barrel was pried open with a crowbar, metal groaning under strain, until the seal broke with a hiss of trapped air. Everyone stepped back. The smell that came next was unbearable, a mix of rust, decay, and rot, the kind of smell that carries the weight of years. One of the officers shined a flashlight inside. The light hit something pale. "Bones," the diver said quietly. "Clothing, too." My son took another step back. His breath hitched. He was staring at the barrel like it was alive, like it might crawl out and point at him. I saw it in his eyes. Recognition. He knew what was inside before anyone else did. The officer reached in with a gloved hand and pulled something out, a scrap of faded fabric and a rusted chain with a small metal tag. The tag caught the sunlight, flashing once before the mud wiped away. There was a name on it, a name none of us expected. The officer read it aloud, and my son's knees nearly gave out. It wasn't my name. It wasn't random. It was the name of a man who'd gone missing 20 years ago. A man from our own town. A man I remembered seeing on flyers once, long before the years made me forget his face. The police had called it a disappearance. The case was cold. Now the river had given him back. The crowd started whispering louder. Some stepped away from my son, others just stared. The officers looked at each other, confused, curious, suddenly cautious. They didn't look at me anymore. They looked at him. The lead detective asked where he had been that morning, who had last been near the river. My son tried to answer, but his words stumbled over each other, thin and cracked. I don't know. I've never seen that before." His voice trembled in a way I had never heard. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. Then came the part that broke the last of his composure. One of the divers said they'd found something else, another small object wedged under the barrel, caught in the chain. A ring. Simple, gold, bent slightly from time. I recognized it before anyone said a word. It was his mother's wedding ring, the same one she'd lost all those years ago near the shed. We'd searched for it for weeks and never found it. He saw it too, and that was the moment the mask shattered. His breath stopped, His body swayed, and for the first time, his face showed everything: fear, guilt, and the knowledge that the river had betrayed him. The officers turned to him fully now. No one spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath. He pushed me into the river thinking it would hide everything. But the river doesn't keep secrets forever. When the ring glinted in the sunlight, everything around us seemed to stop. The wind, the murmurs, even the sound of the river itself. My son's eyes locked on that small band of gold like it had reached up from the mud just to accuse him. He didn't move. His lips parted, but no words came out. The crowd leaned in, waiting for an explanation that would never come. An officer held the ring in his gloved hand, turning it over in the light, then looked toward me, the old man standing in a blanket on the edge of the scene. "Do you recognize this, sir?" he asked. I nodded slowly. My throat felt like it had turned to stone. "It's my wife's," I said. "She lost it 30 years ago. Right here on this land." A ripple went through the officers. I could see their eyes shift toward my son, the pieces beginning to fit together faster than anyone could speak them aloud. He tried to step forward, tried to play the part of the concerned son again, but his movements were clumsy now, the confidence gone. His hands shook. "That doesn't mean anything," he said quickly. "Rings get lost all the time. You don't know." But he stopped himself, realizing too late that every word dug him deeper. The detective didn't argue. He just turned back to the diver who had gone pale beneath his wet hair. "There's more in the barrel," the diver said quietly. "More than one person." The words hit like thunder. The air broke open, gasps, shouts, confusion. Officers moved closer, trying to shield the view from the bystanders. My son staggered back 2 steps, then a third. He looked like a man watching his own past crawl out of the dirt. His face was gray, his lips bloodless. I remember his voice shaking as he said, "You can't pin this on me." But no one had accused him yet. That was what made it worse. His guilt spoke first. The detective's expression hardened. He motioned to 2 uniformed officers to stay near him. The crowd that had once pitied him was silent now, the sympathy gone. Mothers pulled their children back. Neighbors exchanged whispers they'd never take back. Everyone could feel it. The truth had surfaced, and it smelled like the river. They carried the contents of the barrel out carefully. I won't describe it. Some things are better left to the silence they came from. But I saw enough. Pieces of lives lost, faces the years had almost erased. The forensic team whispered to each other about age, cause, and time. The detective didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on my son. "Do you know anything about this?" he asked. My son shook his head, too quickly. "No, of course not. I wasn't even living here when—" But he was. We both knew it. He'd grown up by this river. He'd been here his whole life. The detective didn't respond. He just glanced toward me again. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Then, as if something inside him finally cracked, my son tried to bolt. He turned fast, running toward the trees, but the officers were faster. They caught him before he made it 5 steps, dragging him down in the mud, pinning his arms behind his back. He struggled, cursed, shouted that it was a mistake. But the sound of handcuffs clicking shut silenced him. When they lifted him up, his face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his clothes torn, his breath uneven. He looked at me across the field, not as a son looks at his father, but as a man who's just seen the last lie of his life collapse in front of him. For the first time, he was speechless. Completely, utterly speechless. The detective's voice cut through the chaos, calm and cold. "We'll need to reopen every file that ever touched this river." The river had spoken. The truth that had slept beneath its surface for decades had finally opened its eyes. And the man who thought he could bury his sins beneath the water now stood before the whole town, stripped of every secret, every lie, every mask. The days that followed were heavy and strange, the kind of silence that hangs after a storm, when everything looks the same, but nothing feels alive. The riverbank was sealed off with yellow tape. The news vans came next, their bright lights and cameras turning the quiet countryside into a stage for shame. Reporters spoke the name I'd once been proud to call my son, now whispered like a curse. I sat on a bench outside the sheriff's office, wrapped in a thin blanket, watching strangers discuss the life I thought I knew. The investigation moved quickly. The river gave up more than anyone expected. The forensics team worked for days, dredging up evidence. Pieces of clothing, small metal fragments, personal items long swallowed by mud. Every new discovery felt like another brick added to the wall between us. They found 3 bodies in total. 3. Each one tied back to missing persons cases that had gone cold decades ago. A farmhand who vanished after asking for back pay, a traveling salesman last seen in town, and a woman no one even realized was gone until they read her name in the reports. All roads led to one man, my son. The detectives came to speak with me again. They asked questions I didn't know how to answer. Things about his behavior, his past, the people he'd known. I told them the truth. I hadn't seen this side of him coming. I knew he'd made mistakes, yes. He'd had temper, debts, pride that grew too fast for his own good. But murder? Number. That word didn't fit the boy I'd raised, until I realized maybe it did. They showed me papers from his storage unit. Old photographs, receipts, even maps with red circles drawn along the river. He'd been hiding things in plain sight. Stolen money, false names, secrets buried deeper than any of us could have guessed. And all that time, he'd lived under my roof, eating meals I cooked, looking me in the eye, calling me Dad. I remembered moments that had felt wrong but never explained themselves. The nights he came home with mud on his boots, saying he'd been out fishing when the water was frozen solid. The way he'd flinched when someone mentioned the old missing person cases. The river was his confidant, his vault. He had built an entire second life out of deception, and when he thought I'd discovered it, he tried to erase me too. When the police questioned him, he said nothing for hours. Not denial, not confession, just silence. But when they showed him the wedding ring, the bones, and the chain, something in him broke. Witnesses said he sat there, pale as chalk, eyes empty, and muttered a single sentence. The river was supposed to keep them. After that, he went quiet again. The sheriff told me that line later, his voice uneasy. I remember staring at the wall behind him, trying to process it. The river was supposed to keep them. The words rang in my head like an echo that would never end. That was when I stopped wondering why and started understanding who. The man I thought I knew, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders, the son I'd defended through every storm, was gone long before he ever pushed me into that water. He'd been gone for years. When they searched his house, they found more. Forged documents, old ledgers, fake identities. Everything pointed to a man who had lived in shadows, manipulating, hiding, using everyone who trusted him. I listened as they read the evidence aloud, each word another nail sealing the coffin of the person I used to love. The community changed overnight. People who once greeted me kindly now looked at me with pity, some with suspicion. I didn't blame them. Evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it grows in your own home, wears your last name, and calls you father. At night, I walked back to the river, standing on the same spot where he'd pushed me. The water looked calm again, as if none of it had ever happened. But I knew better now. The river had memory. It had kept his crimes safe until the day it chose to give them back. He wanted to bury me there, but instead, it buried him. The morning they took him away, the sky was gray, the same color it had been the day he pushed me into the river. It felt like the world was coming full circle, though not in mercy, only in reckoning. The police cars lined up along the dirt road, lights flashing red and blue against the fog. Neighbors stood by their fences, whispering, some covering their mouths, others recording with their phones. I stood a few steps back, leaning on my cane, my heart heavier than any man's should ever be. I'd buried friends before, even my wife, but nothing prepares you for watching your own child's life fall apart in front of you. He came out of the house in handcuffs, escorted by 2 officers. His head was bowed, his hair a mess, his shirt half-buttoned, like he hadn't slept in days. The mask he used to wear, that calm, confident expression, was gone now. What stood there wasn't the man he'd pretended to be, but something hollow. He looked smaller, fragile even, but the crowd didn't see that. They saw the monster from the news, the man who'd buried bodies and tried to drown his own father. When he reached the bottom of the porch steps, he looked up and saw me. The noise from the crowd faded for a moment. Our eyes met. I expected anger or guilt or some trace of the boy he once was. But there was none of that. What I saw instead was disbelief, like he still couldn't understand how everything had unraveled, like he still thought he was smarter than fate. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. The detective leading the case stepped forward and read him his rights. My son didn't respond. He just stared past everyone, his jaw tightening each time the flash of a camera hit his face. When the cuffs clicked tighter, he winced, not from pain, but from the humiliation of being seen. For years, he'd built a life on control, on keeping every secret neat and hidden. And now, under the cold light of morning, every lie he ever told was crumbling around him. Reporters shouted questions. Is it true about the other bodies? Why did you push your father? Did you plan it? He said nothing. His silence screamed louder than any confession. One officer opened the back door of the cruiser, but before he stepped inside, he turned his head just slightly, as if trying to find words that wouldn't come. His lips parted once, but no sound followed. Then he looked straight at me, eyes glassy, face pale, and for just one fleeting second, I saw fear. Not the fear of prison or punishment, the fear of being known. The door closed behind him with a dull thud. The crowd began to disperse, whispers still chasing his name down the road. The police cars pulled away one by one, tires kicking up dust. I watched the last one disappear over the hill and felt a strange quiet settle inside me. Not peace, not yet, but something close to release. The weight I'd carried since the river began to lift, little by little, with every turn of those sirens fading in the distance. That afternoon, the sheriff came to see me. He said the evidence was overwhelming, fingerprints on the chains, records tying him to the missing people, even a confession of sorts scribbled in one of his notebooks. You saved a lot of lives by coming forward, he told me. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a graveyard. Every memory I had of my son was tainted now. Every photograph, another reminder of the boy who became a stranger. The town changed after that. The river was no longer a place where children fished or lovers walked. It became a warning, a story people whispered about at night. They said it was cursed, that it swallowed secrets until it was ready to spit them out. And maybe it was, because the day they dragged that barrel from its depths, the river gave back everything it had taken, the truth, the dead, and the man who thought he could hide from both.